In the spring of 1874, a Polish naturalist named John Stanislaw Kubary poled a small canoe through the mangrove channels off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, an island few Europeans had ever bothered to map with any care. He was there to collect specimens for a natural history museum in Hamburg, cataloguing shells and birds for men who would never leave their offices. The tide was low, the water had gone the color of weak tea, and ahead of him, rising out of the shallows where no stone had any business standing on its own, were walls. Not rubble, not scattered boulders left behind by some flood or landslide. Walls built from long six-sided columns of black basalt, stacked one on top of another like cut logs in a woodpile, 25 feet high in places, running in straight lines across water that was, by every geological account, simply a coral reef. Kubary had found Nan Madol. He was not the first outsider to lay eyes on it. Sailors and traders working the Micronesian routes had glimpsed the walls from their decks for decades before him, and said little worth recording. But Kubary was the first to climb out of his canoe, walk the islets on foot, and sit down with a notebook to describe what he found with the discipline of a trained observer, measuring what he could measure and writing down, without embellishment, what the local people told him about who had built it and why. What he wrote that year became the first serious written record of a city that, by the time he arrived, had already stood empty for roughly 200 years, its walls intact, its canals still tidal, its builders and their names surviving only in the mouths of the people living around its edges. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Kubary was looking at, and what any diver or hiker can still walk through today, is not one structure, but very close to 100 of them, a complex of nearly 100 artificial islets, spread across roughly 80 hectares of open lagoon, laced together by tidal canals so precisely that the whole site is sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific, though its stonework predates Venice's own canal engineering by centuries. The islets are rectangular platforms of basalt and coral fill, walled and terraced, rising directly out of water that covers a coral reef, not solid ground. Among them stands the tomb complex of Nandawas, the royal mortuary, its outer walls climbing 25 feet into the air, built from columns that in places run 20 feet long. One single cornerstone at Nandawas has been estimated to weigh 50 tons. Elsewhere across the site, at a platform called Panwi, boulders as heavy as 90 tons have been stacked 8 meters high, log cabin style, with no mortar holding any of it together. The columns simply rest on one another, their own weight and interlocking shape keeping the walls standing for the better part of a millennium. The total mass of worked stone across the entire complex has been estimated at 750,000 metric tons. That is not a number that belongs to a small fishing settlement. It is a number that belongs to a civilization capable of moving, positioning, and stacking weight on a scale that most Bronze Age societies on the far side of the world would have recognized immediately as monumental engineering, the kind reserved for kings and gods. And here is what makes that number impossible to file away quietly. Pohnpei has no metal ore anywhere on the island. There were no draft animals. No wheel has ever been recovered from the site, and none is referenced in any surviving account of how it was built. The nearest deposit of the columnar basalt used to raise these walls sits on the far side of the island, in a district called Socays, and geochemical sourcing, published in 2016, finally confirmed what generations of visitors had already suspected simply by looking at a map. The stone was quarried 25 miles away and carried, by water, to a reef that first had to be filled and built up into artificial land before a single column could be set in place. 25 miles of open water and coral shallows crossed by rafts or canoes, carrying stones that in some cases weighed as much as a loaded delivery truck. No pulley, no animal, no metal tool has ever come out of that lagoon. The first sustained scientific attempt to answer how any of this was accomplished came nearly a century after Kubary's visit. In 1963, an archaeologist named Arthur Sachs led an underwater survey of the channels surrounding Nan Madol, hoping to find a submerged causeway, a line of fallen columns, anything that might explain how stone this heavy had crossed open water to reach the reef. Diving east of the islet called Kerrion, Sachs found what looked, for one brief moment, exactly like what he had come searching for: a line of pillars resting on the seafloor, arranged as though they might once have formed a sunken gate leading toward a place local tradition calls Carnimweso. It appeared, briefly, that the missing piece of the transport puzzle had been recovered. Then the samples came back from analysis. The pillars were coral, not basalt, shaped by growth and current into a column-like form that only resembled work stone from a distance and in poor light. Sachs's survey ended without an answer. No comparable underwater excavation has been carried out at Nan Madol since that season in 1963. The question he went looking for is still sitting exactly where he left it, on a seafloor that has not been seriously searched again in more than 60 years. Not because anyone forbade it, but because the funding and the attention simply moved elsewhere and never came back. Sachs was not the last person to try. In the late 1970s and again through the early 1980s, an archaeologist named J. Stephen Athens conducted a series of excavations at Nan Madol, the most systematic work the site had seen since Kubari's original survey a century earlier. Athens confirmed what earlier visitors had only guessed at, that the earliest human activity on the reef dated back to roughly the 1st or 2nd century, that pottery making on the island had stopped entirely by around 1100, and that the shift to megalithic basalt construction arrived suddenly, not gradually, right around the time the legend says the two brothers landed. There is a second kind of silence at Nan Madol, and it matters more than any failed dive. The Saudeleur dynasty that ruled from this site, beginning somewhere around 1180 or 1200 of the Common Era, left no written language behind. Not one carved tablet, not one ledger, not a single inscribed stone recording who ordered the walls raised, how the labor was organized, or how many hands it took to move a 50-ton cornerstone across a reef. Everything known about the construction of Nan Madol survives for one reason only. It was carried, generation after generation, through spoken memory alone, until an outsider with a notebook finally sat down and wrote it out. And what that oral tradition says is worth taking seriously, precisely because it is the only record that has ever existed. According to Pompeian legend, the site was built by twin brothers, sorcerers named Olisihpa and Olosopa, who arrived by canoe from a distant land called Katau, seeking a place to raise an altar to Nachnison Sapur, the god of agriculture. The brothers are described in the tradition as far taller than the people already living on the island, and the method the story assigns to them is not concealment, and it is not ordinary human labor. It is levitation. The stones are said to have been lifted and carried through the air with the aid of a flying dragon, moved into place by power rather than muscle. Modern researchers who study the tradition tend to read that image as a myth, encoding a lost engineering technique, the kind of story a culture tells across centuries to hold on to the memory of something it can no longer physically perform or fully explain to its own descendants. Whether or not that reading is correct, the account itself has not changed in any fundamental way across a century and a half of being recorded by outside visitors. German missionaries, Spanish colonial officials, Japanese administrators, and finally trained ethnographers, each arriving under a different flag, each writing down the same two names, the same flying dragon, the same god of agriculture. A story held that stable by that many unrelated recorders, across that much political upheaval, is not the kind of thing that gets invented twice by accident. The dates support at least the shape of the legend, even if they cannot confirm the dragon. Radiocarbon dating and uranium-thorium series dating, performed on coral taken directly from the tomb of the first Saudeleur ruler, placed the beginning of megalithic construction at Nan Madol between 1180 and 1200 of the Common Era, a full 400 years before Kubari ever stepped into his canoe. And the dynasty that legend says began with Olosopa did not linger in obscurity once it started. 16 rulers of a single clan governed from this site for roughly 400 years, over an island population estimated at 25,000 people, until the dynasty ended, according to tradition, with an invasion led by a warrior named Isokelekal, who took up residence in the very halls his predecessors had built. And then, for reasons the record does not preserve, because there was no record beyond memory to begin with, the site was allowed to fall empty within a few generations of his own death. The city was not destroyed, it was not buried, it was simply, at some point nobody wrote down, left. Later generations of Pompeians continued to use certain islets for burial and ritual purposes for centuries afterward, which is itself worth sitting with. This was not a lost city rediscovered by strangers who stumbled onto a forgotten ruin. It was a known city, visited, respected, and in places still actively used by the descendants of the people who built it, right up until the moment a Polish naturalist finally thought to write any of it down. Nan Madol is not the only stone city the Pacific has forgotten how it built. 300 miles to the east on the island of Kosrae sits Leluh, a walled complex of basalt platforms, tombs, and residential terraces raised using the same log cabin stacking method, with columns quarried and moved into place without metal tools, pulleys, or draft animals of any kind. Pompeian tradition itself claims a direct link between the two sites, holding that the same builders, or their trained successors, carried their methods from one island to the other. Radiocarbon dating has since shown that Nan Madol is in fact the older of the two, which means that if knowledge traveled between these islands, it traveled outward from Pompeii rather than into it. Roughly 2,000 miles to the northwest, on Guam and across the wider Mariana Islands, a related mystery stands in the form of the latte stones, paired pillars and capstones cut from coral limestone, some standing over 15 feet tall, quarried and raised by the ancestors of the modern Chamorro people centuries before any European ship reached those waters, using techniques that remain only partially reconstructed by the archaeologists who have studied them. Different islands, different materials, different centuries. The same underlying fact holds in every case. A Pacific island population without metal, without the wheel, without a single domesticated draft animal, moving and positioning work stone on a scale that modern engineers, working with cranes and diesel-powered winches, still describe as remarkable when they stand in front of it. This is not a coincidence stretched thin to make an argument. It is a basic, repeated, physically verified capability that the surviving written record, because there was no written record until strangers arrived with paper, was never able to explain in its own words from the inside in real time. There is a third data point worth naming plainly, because it is easy to miss and it changes how the other two should be read. When Nan Madol was formally proposed for the World Heritage List, the nomination documents themselves acknowledged that no one has ever produced a complete, agreed-upon explanation for how the transport was accomplished. Not a fringe blog, not a treasure hunter, the official conservation paperwork submitted by the government responsible for protecting the site states, in effect, that the central engineering question remains open. That is a rare thing to find in writing. Most unexplained sites accumulate theories until the silence gets papered over with confident language. At Nan Madol, the silence made it into the official record instead. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. So set the flying dragon aside for a moment, and the sorcerer's altar with it, and consider only what the physical evidence itself demands. It demands a labor force large enough, organized enough, and skilled enough to identify columnar basalt at a specific outcrop chosen for its natural fracture pattern, quarry it without metal tools, raft or float that stone 25 miles across open water and coral shallows, and stack it with enough precision that walls raised 800 years ago are still standing today, holding their shape against tides that have swallowed far newer construction along the same coastline in the centuries since. Some archaeologists who have worked the tonnage and the distance and the timeline against each other have proposed that the entire population of the island, all 25,000 people, would have needed to contribute labor at some point in the process for the numbers to close at all. That is not folklore dressed up as science. That is an estimate built from weight, distance, and time, arrived at independently of any legend, and it remains the most conservative explanation currently on the table. The evidence has not been carried off to a government warehouse, sealed behind a door with a case number, or quietly reburied under a road. It is still there, in the lagoon, precisely where it was built. The walls of Nan Madol still stand 25 feet high. The canals still fill and drain with the tide, the way they have for 8 centuries. What threatens the site now is not confiscation or classification, it is neglect. The complex was added to the World Heritage List as an endangered property in 2016, not because anyone has been hiding it, but because mangrove roots are slowly working their way into the joints between the columns, prying stones apart a fraction of an inch at a time, and the funding required for full conservation has never fully arrived. Local taboo has, in practical terms, done more to protect Nan Madol over the centuries than any government agency ever has. Many Pohnpians will not enter certain islets after dark, holding to accounts of guardian spirits said to deal harshly with visitors who show the ruins disrespect. Whether or not you take that belief literally, it has functioned as the only consistent conservation policy the site has ever actually had, enforced not by law but by memory, the same tool that preserved the story of its builders in the first place. What Kubari found in 1874 was not a ruin waiting patiently to be explained by the people who happened to arrive after it was already empty. It was a message, left standing in stone because the people who built it had no writing, and therefore no other way to leave one, carried forward for 400 years on nothing but memory, until a stranger with a notebook happened to paddle through at the right tide, on the right afternoon, and thought to write down what an old man on the shore told him about 2 brothers and a dragon. The brothers do not need to have flown for the story to matter. The dragon does not need to have existed. What the walls of Nan Madol prove on their own, independent of any myth attached to them, is that a small Pacific society once organized itself well enough and skillfully enough to do something that still looks, from the water, like it should not have been possible without tools nobody has ever found. Kubari wrote it down and went back to cataloguing shells for a museum that has, by now, largely forgotten his name. The stones he described are still standing exactly where he found them. They are still waiting for someone to explain them properly. And for now, the only ones who ever tried are the descendants of the people whose ancestors built them, telling a story that has not fundamentally changed in 150 years of being written down by strangers who kept expecting, sooner or later, to catch it in a lie, and never once did. On the small islet of Idade, separate from the royal tombs and far quieter than Nan Madol, sits a well that Pohnpian tradition says once housed a moray eel named Nan Samwol, the living form of a sea god. Priests fed the eel the entrails of specially raised turtles, and its acceptance of the offering was read as a sign that the ruling dynasty still held favor. This was not treated as a poetic detail. Archaeologists excavating Idade found a midden, a mound of discarded turtle remains, over 2 meters tall, built up through centuries of the same ritual described in the oral tradition. 333 sling stones, said to have been carried there by the invading warriors of Isokalekel, were recovered from the same islet. In 1995, a television crew attempted to settle the transport question directly. They built a raft, loaded it with a single 1-ton basalt column, and tried to move it along the coast, using nothing but the methods proposed by researchers. The raft failed before it reached open water. The stone that took 8 centuries to place has yet to be moved successfully even once, under controlled conditions, with a single fraction of its original weight. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.